Hello everyone, my name is Alicia Protasevich and I'm currently a master student at Yonsei University Graduate School and I'm a part of English Language and Literature Department. Today we will look at Roland Barthes' essay The Death of the Author and complement it with Michel Foucault perspectives, eventually applying these 20th century ideas to the 21st century reality of artificial intelligence. However, before we dive into the details, here is an overview of our context for today. We will begin with a brief introduction and look at the main claims of the essay. Next, we will discuss the meaning of death of the author and introduce the concepts of the scriptor. Then, we will explore the idea of the text as a tissue of citations and compare the views of Barthes and Foucault. Finally, we will examine the relationship between AI and authorship, and I will leave you with two discussion questions. However, before we move on to the theory, we must acknowledge the theorist. Roland Barthes was a French literary theorist, philosopher, critic, and etc. He was born on November 12, 1915, and died on March 26, 1980, at the age of 64. He moved to Paris in 1924 and started his education there. His studies were focused in classical letters, grammar, philology, and Greek tragedy. So now let's move on to some of the Roland Barthes claims presented in the essay. Originally, we believed that to understand the book, we had to understand the persons behind it, his background, his intention, his personality. However, Barthes critiques this positivist focus on the author's person and rejects the idea entirely. He argues that writing is the destruction of every voice in the space of literature. The individual identity of the writer is lost. It is neither composite space where the voice loses its origin and the author, as a controlling figure, enters into death. Obviously, Barthes does not mean death literally but metaphorically. So what does this mean? The death of the author. And what does this actually mean for us as readers? It means that language, not the author, is the true manager of the writing process. If traditionally we saw the author as the origin or father of the work, Barthes flips this. He argues that the meaning of a text is not inherent in its beginning, but is found in its destination. He concludes that the birth of the reader must be achieved by the death of the author. To let the text live and breathe with multiple meanings, we must stop treating the author's intent as the ultimate truth. The moment a word hits the page, it ceases to belong to the one who reads it. However, if the author is dead, then who is writing? To explain this, Barthes introduces the scriptor. Unlike the author, who was thought to exist before the book, the scriptor is born simultaneously with the text. The scriptor doesn't create, they are void outside of the writing. Writing becomes a performative act where language alone acts and performs itself. There is no inner world being expressed. There is only the gesture of writing. The scriptor is merely the vessel through which language flows, and is merely a tool. This leads to one of Barthes' most famous ideas. The text is a tissue of citations. He does not believe that any text is completely original. Instead, he sees a text as a large space where thousands of cultural ideas mix together. In that case, the writer does not invent anything new, but just reuses the things that have already been done before. Barthes sees a text not as a straight line of a single idea, but as a web of many different influences. In that case, the text is not a simple thought, but a space where many different writings blend and crash into each other. Now let's bring Michel Foucault into the conversation. Barthes sees the author as a roadblock that needs to be removed so the reader can be free. However, Foucault, in his essay What is an Author, views the author as a tool used by society. For Foucault, naming an author is a way for society to control meaning, sort texts, and decide who is responsible for the words. However, both thinkers agree on the main point. The idea of a genius creator is an old myth. The text, these days, works on its own and is not just a reflection of one's person. Finally, how does these concepts could be applied to our today's reality? Artificial intelligence is a perfect example of what Barthes introduced as a scripter. AI does not make things out of air, it mixes together millions of ideas that already exist. It is the physical proof of Barthes' idea that the text is just a web of quotes. Artificial intelligence creates a neutral space because it has no life story, no soul, and no real goals. Because the AI has no personal identity, it forces the reader to become the only person who creates the meaning. The artificial intelligence does not actually speak, it just lets language work on its own, proving that the author was always an idea we could live without. I came up with some discussion questions which would be interesting to think about after that. The first question is, if an AI can perfectly mimic the tissue of citations that Barthes describes, does a human written text then possess a unique value that AI text lacks? And the second question is, if AI has no biography or intent, does it actually provide the neutral space? Now you can see some of the references used throughout this presentation, and thank you so much for your attention.